I never thought I'd find myself living in a hut on a forgotten island. But desperation makes strange choices seem reasonable. When I signed the contract, I told myself it was just a job. Just another seasonal post that would pay the debts I'd been dragging like chains behind me. But now, looking back, I realized that no amount of money could ever justify what I walked into. The offer came in the form of a plain email, buried between bills and spam, a caretaker position, remote housing provided, weekly pay that was far above anything I had ever earned. The only catch was the location, a small island far off the coast, uninhabited except for the hut I was expected to maintain. My job was simple, the message said: keep the place tidy, record the tides, and remain present on site until the contract ended. I thought it sounded peaceful, The city had been wearing me down for years. Crowded trains, endless noise, and the constant weight of people pressing in from every side. The idea of solitude, of waves and seabirds, instead of traffic and shouting neighbors, felt like an escape. I signed without hesitation, and a week later I was packing my things into a single duffel bag. The ferry that carried me there was small, only room for a handful of passengers. Yet on the day of my journey, I was the only one aboard. The captain was an older man, weathered by salt and sun, who didn't speak unless necessary. When I told him I was bound for the caretaker's hut, his expression shifted, though he said nothing at first. It wasn't until the coastline faded and only the horizon remained that he leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "You follow the rules. You'll be fine," he said. "The tides don't forgive those who don't." I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and focused on steering. The sea grew restless as we approached the island. Waves slapped the hull, wind tore at my jacket, and gulls circled overhead with shrill cries that sounded less like birds and more like warnings. From a distance, the island looked like little more than a jagged tooth rising from the water. A ring of black rocks surrounded it, and at the center, nestled against a tree line, stood the hut. It was smaller than I expected, weather-beaten wood, a crooked roof, windows clouded with salt. Yet there was something about it that drew my eyes again and again, as if the hut itself was watching me approach. The captain didn't dock. He brought the ferry close enough that I could leap onto the worn jetty, then tossed my bag after me. "When you see them," he muttered, almost to himself. "Don't look too long." Before I could ask who he meant, he pushed the boat away and turned back toward the mainland. His figure grew smaller, swallowed by mist and distance, until I was left alone with the endless sea. The silence of the island pressed in at once. No human voices, no engines, no signs of life at all. Only the crash of waves against stone and the whisper of wind through the trees. For a moment I felt exhilarated. Alone, yes, but free. The air tasted clean, sharp with salt, and the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction. But as I picked up my bag and began walking the uneven planks of the jetty, a thought slid unbidden into my mind. I wasn't supposed to be here. The island didn't want me. And though I couldn't explain why, I already felt like I had trespassed into something ancient and waiting. The path from the jetty to the hut was narrow and uneven, little more than a trail of packed earth winding through low shrubs. Each step crunched with gravel and shells, as if the island itself had been formed from broken remnants of the sea. I kept glancing back at the ocean, half expecting the ferry to turn around and retrieve me. But the captain's boat was already gone, swallowed by gray mist. I was truly alone. The hut sat a short walk inland, perched just above the high water line. Up close, its age was undeniable. The walls bore deep grooves where storms had scoured them, and the windows rattled in their frames with each gust of wind. A crooked porch leaned toward the beach, its wood swollen with salt and rain. Yet the door opened easily when I tried it, as if it had been oiled recently. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and seaweed, but it was warmer than I expected. A lantern sat on the small table, glowing softly. The sight startled me. I had assumed the place would be empty, but someone had prepared it for my arrival. That someone revealed himself a moment later. A man stepped out from the back room, tall and wiry, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that seemed too sharp for his weathered face. He wore a heavy coat despite the warmth, and he carried himself with the slow certainty of someone who knew this place well. "You must be the new caretaker," he said. His voice was gravelly, but calm. "Name's Harlan. I kept the place before you." I introduced myself, suddenly aware of how small my voice sounded in the hut's wooden belly. Harlan studied me for a long moment, as though measuring whether I'd last. "Not many make it through the season," he said, "but if you follow the rules, you'll be fine. The tides only take those who don't." There it was again, the warning about tides. I remembered the captain's words, and a cold shiver moved through me. Harlan walked to the table and tapped a piece of paper weighted beneath the lantern. The edges were yellowed and soft, as though it had been handled countless times. "These are the rules," he said simply. "You'll want to memorize them before nightfall." I picked up the page. The handwriting was neat, but old-fashioned, ink pressed deep into the fibers. The list read as follows. 1. At dusk, secure every window and door. Do not leave them unlatched, no matter the weather. 2. Never step onto the beach after dark, even if you hear voices, especially if you hear voices. 3. The tides rise higher than they should. If the water reaches the steps, do not look outside until morning. 4. Should you hear knocking on the walls, ignore it. Do not respond. Do not search. 5. If you wake to find the lantern extinguished, relight it immediately. Do not wait. 6. Do not touch the stones arranged in circles near the tree line. They are older than the hut. 7. On the night of the full moon, remain silent from dusk until dawn. Speak no words, no matter what you hear. I read them twice, each line sinking heavier into me. The rules sounded absurd, like fragments of folklore. Yet Harlan's expression was unwavering. "People think this is just a job," he said, watching me. "They don't realize it's a bargain. The tides demand order. Break that, and they notice." I tried to laugh, to lighten the mood, but the sound died quickly in the cramped room. Harlan didn't smile. "How long did you stay here?" I asked. "Longer than most," he replied. His eyes drifted to the shuttered window, but not long enough to forget. He reached into his coat and placed a small brass key on the table. "Locks every window and door. Don't lose it." I slipped the key into my pocket, the weight of it pressing against me more than it should have. As the day waned, Harlan moved around the hut with the efficiency of ritual. He showed me how the shutters bolted, how the lanterns needed trimming, how the tide logs were kept in a leather-bound book near the desk. His hands lingered on each task, not because he doubted me, but because he understood the price of mistakes. When the sun slid low over the sea, he straightened his coat and looked at me one last time. "I'll be leaving before dark. My time here is finished. Yours begins now." I asked if he'd return to the mainland, if I'd see him again. He didn't answer. He only stepped onto the porch, paused to breathe in the salt air, and then walked down the path toward the jetty. I watched until the mist swallowed him whole. The silence that followed was thicker than before, as though the island had been waiting for him to leave. Alone in the hut, I sat at the table and read the rules once more by the glow of the lantern. The ink seemed darker now, the words etched deeper, as though they had been written for me specifically. When the last of the daylight drained away, I found myself standing by the window, staring at the endless line of waves. For a moment, I thought I saw something move just beyond the rockstall shapes swaying where no trees grew. But when I blinked, they were gone. The first night on the island was beginning, and with it, the rules I had promised to obey. That first night, I tried to distract myself with small routines. I unpacked my bag, made tea with the rusted kettle, and wrote a few sentences in my journal. The silence pressed hard against the walls, broken only by the slow breathing of the sea. It should have been peaceful, but the hush felt too deliberate, as if the island itself was listening. When the sky deepened into indigo, I remembered the rules. I went from room to room, locking every door and bolting every shutter. The brass key turned smoothly in the worn locks, the sound echoing in the hut's wooden belly. When I was finished, I lit the lantern on the table and placed it in the center of the room like a watchful eye. For a while, I sat and listened to the tide rising. Waves thudded against the rocks, each crash climbing higher, hungrier. It was strange back home. The ocean's rhythm had always soothed me, but here it was different. Here, the water sounded purposeful, like footsteps drawing closer. Around midnight, I heard it, knocking, a slow, deliberate rap against the wall, just beneath the shuttered window. I froze. The sound came again, 3 knocks this time, spaced evenly apart. My throat tightened. I remembered Rule 4. Should you hear knocking on the walls, ignore it. Do not respond. Do not search. I gripped the table, forcing myself still, but the noise didn't stop. It traveled along the wall, from one corner of the hut to the other, as though something circled the building, testing the boundaries. Then, faintly, I heard a voice. "Hello? Can you let me in? Please, it's so cold out here." The words were muffled by the wood, but undeniably human. My breath caught. Rule 2 slammed into my mind. Never step onto the beach after dark, even if you hear voices. Especially if you hear voices. I told myself it was a trick, some kind of local prank to frighten caretakers. But the desperation in the voice gnawed at me. It sounded like a woman. She cried softly, tapping the window with trembling fingers. I stood without realizing it, my hand halfway to the shutter latch. That was the violation. Not full disobedience, but intent. A moment of weakness that cracked the door between me and whatever waited outside. The lantern flickered. Its steady glow stuttered, shrinking to a fragile ember. Shadows surged across the walls, stretching long fingers toward me. I yanked my hand back from the latch, hard hammering. The voice stopped. The knocking ceased. For a moment, silence reigned again. Then the lantern steadied, burning bright as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. I tried to sleep after that, but every creak of the hut felt like breath on my neck. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under. I woke to gray light spilling through the shutters and the cry of gulls outside. The ocean had retreated, leaving damp lines of kelp tangled along the beach. Stepping onto the porch, I saw footprints. Bare, human footprints pressed deep into the wet sand, circling the hut in uneven spirals. They were too small for a man's, too delicate. They led from the tree line down to the shore, then vanished beneath the waves. I told myself they'd been there before I arrived. Remnants of Harlan or some passing fisherman, but the prints were sharp-edged, freshly made. Worse still, when I turned back toward the hut, I noticed something pinned to the door, a strip of seaweed knotted into a crude shape. It resembled a hand, with 5 limp strands, 4 fingers. My stomach turned. I pulled it free and hurled it into the surf, but the image lingered. The island had answered my hesitation, even almost breaking the rules, carried weight here. That morning, as I logged the tide measurements in the leather-bound book, I caught myself glancing at the shutters again and again, half expecting a knock. I didn't touch the latch again, but the memory of how close I'd come haunted me. Rules weren't just suggestions. They were barriers, and something on this island was waiting for me to slip. The second day passed in uneasy quiet. I tried to fill the hours with work, sweeping sand from the porch, checking the tide logs, mending a loose shutter hinge. But every task felt like a distraction from the memory of the night before. The footprints haunted me. Each time I looked at the beach, I half expected to see new ones forming in the sand, fresh and wet, leading back to the hut. By afternoon, clouds gathered over the sea. The sky darkened into bruised shades, and the wind carried a low moan through the trees. I lit the lantern early, telling myself it was only precaution, though my hands trembled as I struck the match. When dusk arrived, I followed the rules to the letter. Every latch fastened, every shutter bolted, lantern steady on the table. Yet, as the first raindrops struck the roof, I realized I had overlooked one thing: the tide. Rule 3. The tides rise higher than they should. If the water reaches the steps, do not look outside until morning. I thought of it as I sat in the dim room, listening to the storm's swell. Waves crashed louder, closer, until it seemed they were slapping directly against the porch. I wanted to look, to reassure myself the water wasn't near. But the words of the rule pressed like a hand against my chest. Do not look outside until morning. The hut creaked under the weight of wind and sea. Spray hissed against the walls. At some point, I felt the boards beneath my feet vibrate, subtle but steady, as though the hut were breathing with the tide. That was when the knocking began again. Not on the walls this time, on the door. A sharp, insistent rhythm that made the lantern shudder. Open up, a voice called, low and guttural. You can't keep it out forever. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay seated. But then the knocking shifted. Heavy impacts thudded along the porch steps, each one followed by the sound of rushing water. The tide. It had reached the hut. My heart thrashed in my chest. The water should not have risen that far, not with the tide charts I'd studied earlier. Yet I could hear it gurgling just outside the door, sloshing against the wood as though the ocean itself were trying to seep in. The voice grew louder, closer. Just one look. That's all it takes. I pressed my palms over my ears, whispering to myself that it wasn't real, that I was imagining it. But then came something worse. A dragging sound along the window's shutters. Nails or claw scraping wood with deliberate slowness. The lantern sputtered. Its light shrank to a dim glow, shadows crawling up the walls. I snatched the matchbox and relit the wick, hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. When the flame steadied again, the scraping ceased. The storm raged until dawn. I barely slept, dozing in brief, restless snatches, jolting awake at every groan of the hut. When the first pale light seeped through the shutters, I rushed to the door and flung it open. The beach was empty. No footprints, no debris, not even a line of seaweed to mark the tide. But the steps told a different story. Dark water stains climbed halfway up the porch, higher than any natural tide could have reached. The wood was still wet, glistening under the weak morning sun. I traced the stains with trembling fingers, my skin prickling at the thought of how close the ocean had come. It wasn't just the waves. Something had risen with them, something that wanted me to look. That night I understood the truth. The rules weren't warnings against superstition. They were shields. And already, the sea was trying to tear them away. The morning after the storm, I couldn't shake the memory of the watermarks staining the porch steps. They felt like proof, something undeniable, though I wished they weren't. As I ran my hand over the damp wood, I thought again of Harlan's words, "The tides don't forgive those who don't." I needed answers. The hut wasn't large, but there were corners I hadn't explored yet. A trapdoor hid beneath a rug in the back room. At first glance, it seemed like storage, but when I tugged it open, a draft of cool, stale air wafted up. A ladder descended into darkness. Lantern in hand, I climbed down. The space beneath the hut was cramped, its walls lined with shelves. The smell of mildew was stronger here, mixed with brine. Boxers lay stacked in uneven piles, and in the corner sat a metal trunk secured with a heavy clasp. Inside, I found what I hadn't expected. Journals, dozens of them, some bound in leather, others in ragged cloth, their spines warped by dampness. Each bore a name, handwritten across the cover, followed by a year. Curiosity overpowered caution. I opened the first one. June 12, 1974. The voices began again tonight. They sound like the drowned. I fear I will answer them soon. The entries grew frantic with each passing page. Mentions of the rules, of footsteps in the sand, of tides that rose higher than the moon should allow. The final entry read only, "If anyone finds this, do not stay past the full moon." I set it aside, heart pounding, and opened another journal, this one from the 1980s. They don't like silence broken. On the last full moon, I heard one whisper my name. It sounded like my mother. I nearly spoke back. My throat ached with the effort of staying quiet. The entries painted a pattern, stretching across decades. Each caretaker had written the same warnings, the same fears. Some stopped abruptly, pages left blank, as though the writer had vanished mid-sentence. Others ended with scrawled apologies or prayers. But one journal, dated only a few years ago, chilled me more than the rest. Its writer was Harlan. His script was steady, each word deliberate. He described the same rules he had given me, but with one difference, an 8th rule I hadn't seen on the paper. Upstairs, 8. Never trust the one who comes to relieve you. They are already chosen. I read the line again and again, my stomach twisting. Had Harlan left it out on purpose? Or had someone removed it before handing me the page? Closing the journal, I noticed a bundle of papers tucked beneath the trunk. These were older, much older. Their ink had bled with seawater, but the sketches were clear enough. Crude drawings of figures standing knee-deep in waves, arms outstretched toward the horizon. Around them, spirals of stones, just like the ones near the tree line. At the bottom of one sheet was a single phrase, scratched so deep it had torn the page. "The sea remembers." I stuffed the journals back, but that phrase clung to me. If the sea remembered, what exactly did it remember? And what did it want with me? That evening, I climbed the path toward the tree line, where I had avoided going since my arrival. The circles of stones lay scattered among the roots, each one waist-high, perfectly round despite their rough surfaces. Moss grew thick across them, but beneath, I saw grooves cut into the rock symbols I didn't recognize. As I crouched to examine one, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of waves though I was far from shore. For a heartbeat, I thought I heard whispers rising from the circle, faint as breath. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the roots. The rules had warned me, do not touch the stones. I had come too close. Returning to the hut, I forced myself to reread the list by lantern light. The words didn't just seem like instructions now. They were boundaries, keeping something vast at bay. Each line was less about superstition and more about survival. That night, sleep refused me. Instead, I opened Harlan's journal again, searching the back pages. One entry caught my eye. The tides do not simply rise, they carry. They bring what was lost. Those who drowned do not rest. They circle, waiting, drawn to the ones who keep the fire lit. The caretaker is a beacon, and the hut, a lantern upon the shore. My mouth went dry. I pictured the footprints circling the hut, the knocking, the voices calling through the storm. If I was a beacon, then everything I had experienced wasn't random. It was drawn to me. And the worst part was the implication. It had always been this way. Dozens of caretakers before me, all lured into the same cycle. Some survived long enough to write warnings, others didn't. I closed the journal, but the silence outside felt heavier, thicker, somewhere beyond the shutters. The seaside, against the rocks, patient and endless. I realized then that the job I had taken wasn't about maintenance or tide measurements. It was about appeasement. The rules weren't a contract with me. They were a contract with the sea, and I was the latest offering. By the third night, I felt the rules pressing down on me like a weight. They weren't guidance anymore. They were chains. Every creak of the hut reminded me that the sea was listening, waiting for my mistake. That evening, the air felt wrong, heavy, still. The gulls that usually shrieked around the cliffs were silent, their absence as loud as any cry. I bolted every window before the sun touched the horizon, hands trembling with the urgency of ritual. I lit both lanterns, their glow warm against the gathering shadows, but even the light seemed fragile. The first knock came earlier than before, 3 sharp raps against the back wall, as though someone were standing in the sand, impatient. I ignored it, clenching my teeth, but the sound moved along the wall again. Knock, 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 circling the hut like a predator. I whispered the rules to myself, like prayers. Do not respond. Do not look. Do not open. But then, something new. A scrape beneath the floorboards. The knock had changed location, sinking lower, as though whatever circled me had slid beneath the hut itself. The sound grew louder, a wet, dragging noise, followed by muffled thuds that shook dust from the rafters. The lantern flickered violently. I rushed to relight it, but before I could, the flame steadied on its own, unnaturally, as if held in place by unseen hands. My breath caught. That wasn't supposed to happen. A voice rose from beneath the floor, muffled but clear. You shouldn't have read them. The journals. It knew. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair. The voice shifted, becoming higher, softer, eerily familiar. Please let me in. It's so dark down here. It was my mother's voice. Perfectly mimicked, every cadence exact. She had been dead for years, and hearing her now felt like ice searing through my chest. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice bled through. I miss you. Don't leave me out here alone. I wanted to scream, to shout back that it wasn't her, but I remembered the rule. On the full moon, silence. If the rules were consistent, even speaking now might have consequences. So I stayed quiet, shaking, tears burning my eyes. The dragging beneath the hut grew violent. The floorboards bowed, dust raining down, and I realized with dawning horror that the thing wasn't just circling anymore. It was trying to get inside. The tide roared against the rocks outside, higher, faster. Water hissed against the walls. Then another sound. A wet thump on the porch steps, and another, like feet, bare and heavy, slapping against the wood. My throat tightened as the door shuddered under sudden force. A hand door, something shaped like one pressed against the window shutter, making the wood bulge inward. The lantern flared, its light stretching shadows across the walls like reaching arms. My chest burned as though the air had thinned, every breath shallow and strained. Then silence. The sudden quiet was worse than the pounding. It was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like being held underwater. I didn't dare move. Slowly, something scraped across the window nails, long and deliberate, tracing a slow circle around the frame. Then, a whisper. Look. Every part of me wanted to. The command was sharp, magnetic, pulling at my will. My eyes strained toward the shutter, desperate to obey, but I forced them down. Staring at the floorboards until my vision blurred, the lantern flickered again. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw shadows move that didn't belong to me. Tall, thin shapes gliding across the walls, bending unnaturally, too fluid for human forms. One of them bent low, its shadow head tilting toward me. Though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze, heavy, searching. Keeper, it whispered, voice like water bubbling through stone. You hold the light. You call us here. The realization sank like a stone in my stomach. Harlan had been right. I wasn't just a caretaker. I was bait, a lure. The rules didn't only protect me, they kept balance, binding the things outside to certain limits. And now, by listening too closely, by reading what I shouldn't, I had drawn them nearer. The shadows writhed along the walls, stretching until they filled the room. The lantern dimmed, the light smothered by encroaching dark. I fumbled with the matchbox, striking one after another, but the flame refused to catch. My hands shook so badly that matches snapped between my fingers. Then I remembered Rule 5. If you wake to find the lantern extinguished, relight it immediately. Do not wait. But I wasn't asleep. The lantern was dying right before me, and I couldn't relight it. The hut groaned, wood splintering as something pressed hard against the walls from every side. Shadows seeped between the cracks, liquid and alive. Reaching across the floor like black tidewater, I stumbled back until my shoulders hit the wall. Nowhere left to retreat. The shapes pressed closer, whispering in a chorus of stolen voices. My mother, the ferry captain, even Harlan. Each voice begged, pleaded, commanded, and then, without warning, the lantern blazed bright. A searing white light burst outward, throwing every shadow into retreat. The walls stopped shuddering, the whispers cut off mid-word, and the silence of the island rushed back in. I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The lantern glowed steady once more, calm as though nothing had happened. My ears rang in the stillness, and the only sound was my own shaking breath. For a long time, I couldn't move. My body felt hollow, my mind raw. Whatever had pressed against the hut had been real, and it had nearly gotten in. When dawn finally came, I stumbled onto the porch. The steps were soaked, watermarks climbing even higher than before. On the sand below, shapes lingered, circles of footprints, overlapping, countless. Some were small, some wide, some deep enough to pool with water. They led in spirals toward the sea, vanishing into the waves. I realized then that the hut wasn't just a shelter. It was a boundary. And every night, the tide tested that boundary a little harder. Soon, it would break. For 2 days after the encounter, I lived in a haze of dread. Every task felt mechanical, sweeping, boiling water, logging the tides, yet my mind circled endlessly around what I'd seen. The shadows, the whispers, the way the lantern had flared on its own, saving me in the final moment. The journals had warned me, but they hadn't explained how. I needed answers, and the only person who might still hold them was Harlan. On the third morning, I heard the distant putter of an engine. I rushed to the porch, heart leaping at the sight of the ferry nosing through the mist. Relief flooded me. I wasn't abandoned. Someone was coming. But when the boat docked, it wasn't the old captain. It was Harlan. He stepped onto the jetty with the same steady gait, his coat drawn tight against the wind. He looked unchanged, though his eyes seemed deeper, heavier, like tide pools pulling downward. "You lasted longer than I thought," he said, climbing the path toward me. I stared at him, words catching in my throat. "What are they?" I finally asked. "The things in the tide. The voices. What do they want?" Harlan studied me for a long moment before answering. "They want what the sea always wants, to take back what it's given, to drag everything into itself." He stepped onto the porch, glancing at the lantern still burning inside the hut. "And you're the light that calls them, the keeper. Without you, the tide wouldn't rise this far." His words landed like a stone in my gut. "So that's why the job exists, not to keep the hut standing, but to keep me here." Harlan didn't deny it. His silence was answer enough. My voice shook. "You knew I'd be bait. I told you to follow the rules," he said evenly. "That was the best I could give you." The 8th rule from his journal burned in my mind. "Never trust the one who comes to relieve you." I stepped back. "You left it out on purpose." "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because if I'd written it, you wouldn't have stayed, and someone has to." Anger surged, hot and hollow. "So you tricked me into this." Harlan's eyes flicked toward the sea, where the waves rolled heavier than usual, dark shapes stirring just beneath the surface. "Tricked, save TK. It what you want. The tides demand a keeper. If no one holds the light, they come ashore. They don't just take the hut. They take the coast, towns, cities." I shook my head, struggling to breathe. "That's not a choice. That's a sacrifice." He sighed, a sound as tired as the sea itself. I didn't choose this either. None of us do. We just carry it long enough until someone else steps in. The truth settled like lead. Every caretaker had been deceived, lured here under the promise of pay and solitude, then shackled to the rules. Each one eventually broken, replaced, forgotten. Harlan stepped closer. His voice softened. You've seen what happens when the rules bend. You've heard them. Do you really want to know what it's like if the hut stands empty? For a moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker across his face, but it passed quickly, leaving only resolve. I came to bring you supplies, he said, setting a canvas bag on the porch. Food, matches, oil, enough to last another month. After that, it won't be me who comes. His words chilled me. You mean? I whispered. They'll send someone else. He nodded. And then it will be your turn to leave. If you survive. My stomach twisted. Leave where? Did he mean back to the mainland or somewhere else entirely? Before I could ask, he turned toward the jetty. Remember the rules, he said. They're all that keep the tide from swallowing you whole. And then he was gone, his figure shrinking into the mist as the ferry pulled away. I stood on the porch, the canvas bag heavy in my hands, the rules burning in my mind. For the first time, I realized the truth. The island wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, and Harlan hadn't freed me. He'd passed the chains to my wrists, just as someone had once done to him. That night, I couldn't bring myself to light the lantern. The bag of supplies sat on the table, untouched, a silent reminder of Harlan's betrayal. His words circled my head like gulls over a corpse. Without you, the tide wouldn't rise this far. The keeper is the bait. The lantern flame had saved me before, but now I saw it differently. It wasn't just light, it was a beacon, summoning whatever pressed against the tide. Keeping it burning meant feeding them, inviting them closer. I stared at the matchbox for hours. The hut swallowed in darkness until the tide began to stir. The first sound was a low hum, like the groan of a ship's hull deep underwater. Then came the voices. Not just one this time, dozens, male and female, young and old, calling through the storm in perfect chorus. Keeper, keeper, keeper. My hands shook as I pressed against the shutters, holding them closed, even though the latches were fastened. The boards shivered beneath my grip, as if something immense pressed its weight against the wood, testing for weakness. I thought of the rules. I thought of the stains on the steps, rising higher with every night. And I thought of Harlan, vanishing into the mist, leaving me chained to this place. Maybe the rules weren't meant to protect me at all. Maybe they were designed to keep the creatures satisfied just enough to spare the mainland. If that was true, then I had two choices: obey and spend the rest of my life here as bait, or break the rules completely. The decision rose inside me like a tide of its own. I struck the match. The sulfur flared in the dark. My hand hovered over the lantern wick, and then, deliberately, I blew it out. The voices outside faltered. The scratching at the shutters stilled. For a moment, silence pressed in so heavy it hurt my ears. Then the tide roared. Water slammed against the walls, so hard the hut shook on its stilts. The door buckled inward. Spray burst through the cracks, cold and stinging. I stumbled back, clutching the matchbox like it was a weapon. Come out. The voices hissed together, a single, unified whisper. Join us. The floor tilted as the water surged higher. I realized, with a sickening lurch, that the hut itself was being lifted, not drowned, carried. The stilts groaned and snapped one by one, torn from the sand. I scrambled for the canvas bag, shoving it over my shoulder. If the hut was going to be dragged into the sea, I wouldn't go with it. I kicked the door open and leaped into waist-high water. The tide was boiling with shapes, pale arms reaching through the foam, clawing at the air. I fought them off, wading toward the line of trees inland, but the sea followed. Each step I took, the water surged behind me, flooding further inland than it ever should. as if the ocean itself had chosen me, refusing to release its claim. My lungs burned. My legs trembled. I forced myself forward, clinging to branches, hauling myself through the thicket until I found higher ground. The water chased, frothing at my heels, before it slowed. Stopped. I collapsed onto the wet earth, chest heaving, the bag still strapped across me. When I looked back, the hut was gone. The tide had swallowed it whole, leaving only froth and broken wood swirling in the waves. But the rules remained etched in my mind, every one of them broken. The sky was gray, the air thick with salt, but for the first time since I'd arrived, the voices were silent. I didn't know if I'd doomed the coast or saved myself. Maybe both. But as I sat on that patch of high ground, soaked and trembling, I realized one thing with hollow certainty. The island wasn't finished with me yet. Because if the rules existed to hold the sea back, and I had just broken them all, then the real test hadn't even begun. The next morning, I woke on the same patch of high ground, shivering, salt in my hair, lungs still burning. The sea was calmer now, almost polite in its retreat, but I knew better. It wasn't gone. It never went. I looked back toward the island. All I could see were the jagged rocks rising like teeth from the water, and a few splintered remnants of the hut bobbing in the waves. My pulse slowed, but unease clawed at my chest. Something about the shapes of the rocks, their angles felt deliberate, as if arranged not by nature, but by an intelligence older than memory. I should have been relieved. I should have felt free. Instead, I felt watched. The whispers began again, soft and distant at first, threading through the wind. Voices I thought I had escaped. My mother, Harlan, even the ones from the journals, all calling, none angry, none desperate, just patient, waiting. And then I saw it. A single figure standing at the edge of the water on the remains of the jetty. Tall, thin, featureless, limbs stretched and fluid like liquid shadows. It lifted one arm, pointing toward me, and I realized with a jolt that its gesture was not an invitation, it was a command. The tide surged again, rising unnaturally fast, curling around the rocks as if counting the seconds. I understood in that instant. The rules weren't gone. They had simply reset. The hut might be destroyed, but the island did not forgive disobedience. Not truly. I ran, scrambling into the tree line, my eyes flicking to the horizon where the waves hissed and boiled. Behind me, the whispers multiplied, circling, pressing closer. Every instinct screamed to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I fell to my knees, gasping, hands digging into wet earth, and a cold realization settled over me like the tide itself. I hadn't survived. I had only delayed it. The shadows on the water thickened, shapes forming that I had thought were impossible, hundreds of them, all watching, all waiting for me to falter again. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the glimmer of light, a lantern, steady and warm, bobbing on the horizon near the shore. I froze. It was another caretaker, someone else, drawn here just like I had been, carrying the light I had abandoned. And with it came the cycle. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My voice wouldn't speak. The whispers grew louder, chanting together in a rhythm like waves breaking over stone. Keeper, 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 dot. And as the first of them emerged from the water, shapes taller than men, arms stretching impossibly long, I understood the truth in a hollow, chilling certainty. The island did not forgive. It did not release. It only waited, and it was already hungry for me again.